in American Fork. Mark, he has a question about the Article 1 project. Mark, you're on the line with the Congressman and Senator.
Thank you. My question is about judicial overreach. Article 1, Section 1 gives no legislative power to the judicial branch either, and yet rulings like Roe versus Wade are regarded as the law of the land and enforced as law. In my view, that's unconstitutional and not really law. So what does your project do against judicial overreach?
Okay, Mark, thank you for your question. First of all, you're absolutely right in pointing out that sometimes our legislating, our improper legislation comes not from the executive branch but from the judicial branch. And as with the executive branch, sometimes when it occurs in the judicial branch, it is the fault of Congress, because in many instances this is the product of vague, ambiguous legislation passed by Congress that basically invites the courts to make up the law as they go along, as litigation arises. So one of the prongs of our effort will involve reviewing legislation that gives too much discretion to the courts and thereby invites judicial lawmaking. Now, with respect to decisions like Roe versus Wade, I share your view, Mark, on the fact that that is a usurpation of authority. First of all, things like Roe versus Wade ought to be decided at a state level, not at a federal level, given that there's nothing in the Constitution that makes abortion a federal issue. It's also not something that should be decided by the federal courts, and yet the Supreme Court in 1973 went down that road anyway. It's one of the reasons why I take very seriously my role as a U.S. Senator when reviewing the President's judicial nominees. I look for any indication as to whether or not any particular judicial nominee would have a likely tendency to engage in that kind of legislating from the bench. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers there. There's no silver bullet, but we can be more careful than we've been in the past about reviewing the President's judicial nominees, and we can also be more careful in drafting legislation as we're going to be doing through the Article 1 project to make sure that we're not delegating too much power to the courts.
Great point, Senator, and I would add to that, the Article 1 project will look at Supreme Court cases like the 1984 Chevron case that I mentioned earlier, cases that have chipped away at congressional authority and how we can get around that with legislative solutions. And so that will be part of our focus. But Mark, you and all the listeners out there, when it comes to these judicial issues, are going to have as much say as we could possibly have up here through the Article 1 project, or even through legislating through whoever our next president is likely to be. We have 3 Supreme Court justices that are in their 80s. It's a very good likelihood that the next president is going to have an opportunity to appoint several Supreme Court justices, and the senator spoke about the need to not have activist judges, and I think we've seen the negative impact of some of the appointments that President Obama has made, not just at the Supreme Court level, but throughout the district and circuit courts, and the impact that has, where it's eroded the separation of powers that's always made our country great, and that Congress is the body that should be making laws, and that the Supreme Court and the judicial branch should be the body that's interpreting those laws instead of legislating from the bench. And so it's a problem that you can help with out there, and I hope that it's something that folks will take into consideration, the gravity of what's at stake here in this election in 2016, and how it's going to impact the judicial branch.